As I said, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My colleague pointed out that it is Pancake Day today, so I'm sorry if we're keeping you from any pancakes, but we're really delighted to have you with us. To quickly run through the agenda, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jo Moodie at the Environment Centre, and then we'll hear from Daniel Ayre, Historic Environment Team Leader at Winchester City Council, speaking on retrofit and traditional buildings. Stuart Mills from WinACC is going to lead the Q&A section alongside Daniel. And finally, we'll wrap up with some further support that is available through the My Home Made Better project. Jo, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I believe you should have slide control when you're ready to take over.
Thank you, Bea. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight. I'm Jo. I'm the retrofit advice team lead at the Environment Centre, working mainly on our My Home Made Better advice service. So I've just got a couple of slides to introduce a few key themes around retrofit before I hand back over. So when we discuss somebody's home with them through our service, we base the conversation around the whole house retrofit framework. And this considers the whole of the home and gives the opportunity to plan individual measures in an order that makes sense financially and technically. So as outlined on the slide here, a retrofit plan ideally starts with repairs and maintenance. So that's fixing any leaks or blocks, gutters first, because the last thing you want is rainwater getting into your insulation or finding out that your roof needs repairing after you've put the solar panels up there. So then it's the quick, cheap wins, something as simple as changing light bulbs or requesting a smart meter to get ready for other technologies or tariffs. And then it's the big one, which is keeping the heat in. So finding ways to insulate the home or improve the glazing. And alongside this, it's really essential to look into good ventilation to prevent moisture buildup. Now, by improving the insulation first, you reduce the heat demand of the property, which helps with the next stage, which could be replacing the heating and hot water system. And nationally, we're transitioning towards our main heating fuel being our renewably generated electricity, with heat pumps the most efficient way of using this electricity. But there are other options available to suit a range, a range of different homes. And then finally, once all that's done, it's time to think about generating your own energy, perhaps with solar panels. So whilst this is the ideal sequence of events for a whole house retrofit, we do recognise that everybody's home, circumstances, and preferences are different, and any retrofit plan would always be informed by all these factors. So you're probably thinking, well, this is all very well and good, but how is it going to work in my home? It was built too long ago for many of these things to be appropriate, and it's absolutely right that energy retrofit in an older home brings extra challenges. Our building techniques and regulations have changed a lot over the years. Modern houses have insulation when they're built. When we go back a few decades, we weren't putting very much insulation in, but homes may have had a fairly standard cavity and loft that's easier to insulate, and there may not be any real difficulties thinking about heat pumps or solar panels. But if we go back further to the 1930s or earlier, things were very different. Homes were not built with energy efficiency in mind. They generally had open fires and plenty of ventilation, drawing fresh air into the home and up through the chimney. Building materials were very different, generally more porous, prone to soaking up moisture, and construction methods were different. So older homes may have solid walls or cavities that are very different to modern cavities. So, as you'll know, choosing the correct methods and materials for insulating these homes is really crucial for managing moisture, avoiding damp, and of course, preserving any character that's important in an older home. And that's the same for choosing whether or not to fit solar panels or heat pumps, for example. And if your home's a listed building or in a conservation area or national park, you'll have other restrictions to try and navigate. So all of these things coming together can start to make retrofit seem insurmountable, but you're all here tonight because you understand the enormous benefits that we could achieve by finding ways of improving and future proofing our older building stock, which at the end of the day makes up a significant proportion of our homes in the UK. So we stand to make a real impact here if we're successful. And just as our predecessors found ways to fit electricity or bathrooms or radiators into these homes, so our challenge is to transform how these homes are consuming energy to make improvements now and for the future. And hopefully, what you'll discover tonight is that there are lots of options, lots of possibilities, and that with the right advice and the right tradespeople involved, these challenges can be overcome. So we'll stop there and hand back over to B, who will introduce the next part of the session.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jo, for that introduction. I'm delighted now to hand over to Daniel Ayre, Historic Environmental Team Leader at Winchester City Council, who will speak for about 10 minutes on a deeper dive into some of those topics. Just to mention, you are welcome to start putting questions into the Q&A box while Daniel's speaking, and I'll keep an eye on them so that we can pose them during the Q&A later. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much, B. Right, hopefully you can now see my screen. Brief introduction, who am I and why am I here? Well, as the previous speakers have said, I have the very grand title of Historic Environment Team Leader for Winchester City Council. In old money, I'm a conservation officer. What I'm interested in is old buildings and how we can look after them, make them fit for the future, and really encourage people to look after and love their buildings. Throughout my career, increasingly we've become aware that historic buildings are often not perceived in a particularly good light when it comes to energy efficiency. It's often claimed that these buildings are cold, that they're difficult to look after, and as a result, many people don't want to do the things that we want to do. They don't want to look after them in the way that we would really wish them to do so. To try and combat this perception, when I started at Winchester, one of the first projects I worked on was to produce a guide to help homeowners and people who look after historic buildings to understand what sort of things you could do to make that building more energy efficient. It's shown here on the link and also the QR code. I appreciate that many people on the call today probably don't live in the Winchester district. Various other councils have got very similar things that they've done subsequently. As they do say, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. So I'm very pleased if I've started a small trend in this way. Well, what is retrofit? I think Joanne has introduced this rather nicely, but retrofit is a huge topic. Simply, you can define it as any work to an existing building to improve its energy efficiency. The most obvious initial thing you really should think about if you're looking at retrofitting a building is to try and repair it. Simply put, a dry building is a warm building. It can be relatively simple things, making sure your gutters are clear and free flowing, making sure there's no holes in the roof, your walls are thoroughly pointed. You can move on to more intensive things. You can consider various different sorts of insulation to ceilings, walls, floors. You can improve your heating system, air source heat pumps being increasingly popular, or you can look into different sorts of appliances, things that may be more efficient than their predecessors, and ways to use less energy throughout the home. Retrofit is not just about renewable technologies. It's not necessarily about solar panels, but they have their place. And it's not just about adding a heat pump to your home, but they all have a part to play. When we talk about historic buildings, quite often that term will be used interchangeably with traditional building. When we say traditional building, we mean a building that is built in a traditional way. And generally, these buildings were built before World War II when construction methods changed. Typically, the key characteristics of a traditionally constructed building is that the materials will vary from a modern building. We won't have vast amounts of concrete or plate glass. They will be made of local materials. In our part of the world, this is typically brick, sometimes flint, occasionally timber framing, and often it will have plain clay tiles or slates on the roof. These materials are locally specific. They vary from place to place. I'm originally from Devon, and lots of the buildings down there traditionally were built of stone or cob. We don't have that vernacular tradition here. It's brick and clay tiles seem to be much more prevalent. But the key difference between traditional buildings and contemporary buildings is the way in which they respond to air and water. You might have heard people saying historic buildings breathe. What we mean by that is that the building is capable of allowing moisture and air in and out of the building. This is a really important feature in the fact that it enables buildings to absorb some moisture, but also to allow that moisture out of the building. In doing so, these buildings can be very healthy and self-regulating for their internal environment, and typically can be very robust, as these buildings self-medicate in lots of ways to treat the problems that they may experience throughout their long histories. You might find an equivalent modern building, which has issues of moisture ingress and damp, is incapable of solving the problems in quite the same way because it's designed differently. It's designed to be a sealed system which keeps moisture outside and extracts any moisture internally using mechanical ventilation. When either of these things fail, the building often experiences problems. It starts to become damp and cold. Traditional buildings often benefit from not necessarily having to work in this way because provided they're treated properly, they will allow the air and moisture within the building to move around more appropriately. This diagram is a really interesting way of illustrating this because it shows the different sorts of construction that you typically find in modern buildings and traditional buildings. Most traditional buildings you will find being of solid wall construction, whereas modern buildings have cavity walls. The book that this is sourced from, Old House Eco Handbook, I can thoroughly recommend to anybody who's interested in this subject. It's a detailed book which has enough information to satisfy people like me who do this for a living, but it's also written in a way that is really easy to understand and break down, and has got different chapters depending on what topic you're particularly interested in. So I can thoroughly recommend it. Hopefully, these myths, you'll recognize them for what they are, given the fact that you've subscribed to attend this webinar this evening. Historic buildings aren't bad for the environment. They've existed long before we've had the climate crisis. Historic buildings are not always cold. Indeed, any building can be cold, whether it's modern or historic. But there's lots of things we can do, as we'll learn this evening, to make them less cold. It's not too difficult to make historic buildings energy efficient. It just can be challenging. It requires thought and care to do it properly. And you'll never get permission. Well, the fact that I'm here and talking about this in an enthusiastic way hopefully gives you enough indication that we're really positive about these things, and we want to try and help people make their historic buildings more energy efficient. And that's not just Winchester, that's across the whole county. When we're thinking about making any building more energy efficient, making it warmer, we have to try and think about energy and carbon in the most holistic sense. Typically, the thing we're focused on is the subject in the middle, the operational energy. How do we reduce our heating bills? How do we make sure that we're not spending more money looking after the building than we really want to? But we've also got to think about the energy that actually goes into that building for its construction, for its maintenance, for looking after it. As somebody who's really passionate about historic buildings, I'd rather not talk about demolition energy, but it's an invariable part of the carbon cycle. So whenever you're thinking about anything, any work to a historic building, try and think about the holistic effect of everything you're doing. Think about the materials you're using. Where do they come from? How much energy do they take to produce? Think about how you can recycle and reuse materials rather than simply replacing them. But ultimately, the key thing I would take away from this is that simply by insulating and reusing and making a historic building more energy efficient, you are preserving embodied carbon. So just by looking after an old building, you're taking a really strong piece of climate action. Where do you start if you're trying to retrofit a building or make your home warmer? The first thing for anybody undertaking this sort of work has got to really be understanding. And here are some suggestions that I've sort of come up with throughout my career. Often when people buy a historic building, they come in with loads of ideas of things they want to change, but invariably their plans change as they live with a building. And this is just the same with retrofit. I strongly suggest that you take time to live with your building through the seasons, as this will help you to understand the way it works, the way you use it. Any problems that are hidden when you first occupy it may transpire during the course of your ownership. Getting an understanding for the way this building changes through this period of time will be really helpful. Recording your energy use can be another good thing. Understanding how you use your energy, other particular times of day, particular seasons. Sometimes it's possible to do this. If you have a smart meter, you'll be able to notice when you're actually using more energy and it's costing you more. Or you could also contact your energy provider, who should be able to give you a breakdown of the energy units that you're using in an average month. If you are planning any retrofit, you really have to understand how your building is constructed. Hopefully this is apparent from one of the earlier slides when I spoke about the differences in construction between contemporary and traditional construction. But this is really vital to make sure that any work that you do to the building works with the fabric of the building rather than against it. I mentioned earlier that it's really important to ensure that any building you're hoping to retrofit is in a good state of repair. So understanding its condition is really vital to this. The final point may be a little bit more tricky to understand. Understand its significance. What do we mean by significance? This is all about the heritage value of a building, not just for us, but for those who come after us. It's often been said that we don't necessarily own our buildings, nor do we inherit them. We're merely loaning them from our children. Significance is all about trying to make sure that the things that we do to our buildings are things that subsequent generations won't come after us and regret that we did them, so that we can pass on the wonderful stock of historic buildings that we have to those who come after us in as good, if not a better condition than we received them. And understanding this significance can really help you to make sure that you're making the most informed choices about how you can make your building warmer and more energy efficient, whilst also not doing so in a way that destroys its character or causes irreversible harm. If ever you are planning a retrofit, the key thing you're going to need to do is get appropriate advice. And typically that will mean for historic buildings that you might need to look slightly further afield to find that advice. The sorts of people who do work on contemporary buildings may well have done work on historic buildings, but experience purely in contemporary construction doesn't really qualify somebody to give appropriate advice or guidance for a historic building. And equally, every building that we deal with is different in some way. Even if the buildings were built, say, a Victorian terrace, houses built at the same time, same form of construction, buildings have been used differently. They've had different lifespans. So it's really important to think about every building individually. And there's different sorts of professionals who can give you this sort of advice. The most obvious one is perhaps a retrofit coordinator, somebody who's accredited to, there's a scheme of recognition past 2035. These people specialize in giving guidance to homeowners as to what you can do to make your building energy efficient. And if you commission somebody like this, they will prepare for you effectively a shopping list, a list of things that they think you should do in order of which are the most important and which are perhaps slightly less vital. Sometimes you might find you can get good advice from an architect or surveyor. These groups are typically regulated by RIBA, the Royal Institution of British Architects, or the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. They've got specialist subgroups for people who specialise in historic buildings. These people are really useful because they will know how these things can work in the most holistic sense and do a lot of research themselves to understand what products and materials are available today and which ones are the best to use. There's other local groups available. So in my part of the world, in Winchester, we're very fortunate to have WinACC, and Stu, who's on the call today, he's also one of the WinACC team. But there will be other groups available in different towns and villages across the districts. Talking to these groups are really helpful because they will have local knowledge of who works in a local area, what's worked for them, what hasn't worked, and they have a much closer ear to the ground than perhaps somebody who does work more nationally across the whole country. When you're buying a traditional building or working to do building work to it, you may find that you need to get special building materials. So you might be familiar with lime mortar, for example. Quite often the people who sell these materials and provide them also provide insulation materials that are designed to work with traditional buildings. And I suppose the most obvious source of advice, for me at least, is going to talk to your local council. At Winchester, we're very happy to provide advice to anybody who owns a historic building, whatever age, whatever category of protection, to help them to make that building more energy efficient. But you can approach anybody else that you'd like advice from in any council where you are. Joanne spoke earlier about the whole house approach, and this is something we really encourage for historic buildings, because it's important when you're retrofitting not to think purely in terms of technology, but also not just to think purely in terms of insulation. You've got to understand the building as a whole and how you live with it. And a key thing with the whole house approach is it's all about mitigating risk by making sure that you're not having unintended consequences from doing things in the wrong way, but also that the end result you're creating is a healthy and comfortable environment. And health in internal air quality is something we're increasingly aware of. And this diagram gives you a sort of a summary of the quite technical process for how you would go through a retrofit and the sorts of things a retrofit coordinator would need to guide you through. The area I'm most often involved in is giving people advice about permissions. This is important because if you don't get the right permission you need, it can be really difficult and really expensive to deal with. So as a broad summary of the sorts of permissions you need, if you're doing something to the exterior of a building, you most likely to need planning permission if you're changing the way it looks. If you live in a listed building, that permission and that restriction really extends not only to the exterior, but also to the interior. Really, if you're planning on a retrofit for a listed building, do go and talk to your local council because there'll be specific advice available for you. Building regulations are a different but related scheme of permission, and they all relate to how works would be carried out and making sure that they're done in a way which is safe, is suitable in the event of a fire, but also meets sort of minimum energy efficiency standards. Depending upon the building you're in, there's flexibility around those, but it's still something you need to sort out. In rare instances, you may end up living in a house which is both listed and on a scheduled monument. A scheduled monument is an archaeological designation, so it relates to things below ground. But the photo you can see on the screen in front of you is of Peninsula Square in Winchester, which is a 19th century building built on the site of Winchester Castle, which is a scheduled monument. So the permissions you need to work on something like this are rather greater than perhaps you might need for elsewhere, but all perfectly achievable with the right advice and consideration. But the key thing is you've got to make sure you get the right permission before you do the work. This news article is perhaps a rather extreme example of somebody who did all sorts of work to a listed building, not necessarily for energy efficiency reasons, but they ended up being prosecuted by their local council and had a rather colossal fine. So seriously, if you're thinking of doing something, check first before you start. I can't emphasize that strongly enough. There's a few case studies I'd like to just briefly run through to show what sort of approaches you can take to retrofit. And this is perhaps one of the best ones I've yet come across. Phil and Chris, who own this house in Winchester, they're really committed to trying to make their home warmer. And they did a lot of work to improve its energy efficiency, and they've done all the quick wins, the secondary glazing, the draft proofing, but they wanted to do a bit more, and this is where they got a really good architect, Rupert Cook from Military Cook Mitzman, involved to give them some advice. And it was a textbook example of how to do this properly. They got his advice, they came to me to say what I thought. They got the relevant permissions. They've now carried out the work, and as I understand it, it's working beautifully. So very pleased to support this. Quite often, we're asked about replacement windows, and it's not all about replacement windows until, in this case, clearly it is. This application was quite a good way of demonstrating how you can get permission for this where you need it, because they were able to demonstrate that all of the windows in this house were in fact not historic, but were more recent. And through this, it was enough to justify us giving them a listed building consent to replace their windows. However, if you look very closely at the diagrams below, the drawings, you'll see that actually some of these windows are really very recent, and some of the windows were installed in 2015. Really, replacing windows that are, well, by now 11 years old, it may help you to reduce your operational energy, but is, in my opinion, a rather large waste of the embodied energy in those windows. So it's key to think about how you can use your building in the most efficient way so you're not wasting the energy you already have. I realise that this evening is all about domestic properties and homes, but this is a good example of how you can perhaps think about where you could put solar panels on a building. And in this example, the community shop in West Meon had a rear extension with a south-facing roof, and it was ideal to put some solar panels on. And we were only too happy to give them permission. I believe they even got a grant to do this from the city council, which is positive because we're very keen to encourage people to do this. And these same considerations apply to any house. So if you have an opportunity, do look into it. But with any retrofit, there's always risks. Sometimes retrofits can be done badly and they don't work. In worst case situations, they damage the building. And in doing so, they can create a really unhealthy environment in which the air is humid, it traps moisture. And in this situation, repairing the building is almost more difficult than doing the retrofit in the first place. So really, if you're going to do or think about making your home more energy efficient, the key thing to take away from it is insulation requires ventilation. You want to make sure that you're not trapping damp, moist air in the building, but you're allowing it to escape. But as with any work to a historic building, there's other things to think about. Be wary of people who are selling you things that sound too good to be true. And perhaps to combat this, seek a range of advice. Talk to the local groups who know what's worked in their local area. Understand your building, seek the advice from the specialists. But the key thing with historic buildings is you don't have to do a retrofit all in one go. Sometimes the smallest steps can make the biggest improvements at the outset. So I hope this has been helpful to give you an understanding for what sort of things you might be able to do to make your building more energy efficient. It's not a precise guide, but by all means, if you've got any further questions, do come and talk to your local council and we'll be very pleased to help you. Right, I think I'm going to hand over to my colleagues now, but thank you very much for taking the time to listen.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that superb overview. Yeah, really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. We'll now move into the Q&A part of tonight's webinar. We've had some questions come in already, which is fantastic. Just to say, we will work through them mostly chronologically. So if you've got a burning question, it might be worth putting it into the Q&A box sooner rather than later, because we will be wrapping up at 7:30 tonight. So to start with, I wanted to introduce my colleague Stu Mills at Winchester Action Against the Climate Crisis. Hi Stu, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, no problem. Hi.
We will be doing a bit of a varied question passing between Stu and I think Daniel will contribute as well. So the first we've got from Paul, who says he signed up to a group installation of solar panel and battery improvement through Solar Together, but he's in a conservation area with Article 4. Is there absolutely no way I'm able to proceed with these renewable technologies?
Okay, I think this is probably one for Dan, undoubtedly. I think I'm curious where Paul lives, and I'm sure Dan is as well. I did come across a conservation area in Southampton the other day. They got Article 4 directions, but Dan, can I pass this one on to you as a planning question?
Sure. Yes, so I actually also live in a house in a conservation area with an Article 4 direction. So I know what it's like. And it does depend upon what the Article 4 direction actually regulates. Quite often in conservation areas, they're used to manage change to the front of the building. So it really depends upon whether the roof slope on which you want to install the solar panels are on the front. If it's on the back, most likely you might not need permission. Again, I would check that with your local council. councils will be quite keen to try and support you to make your building more energy efficient. But if you're in an area where they're trying to control what happens on the front, then they may be slightly more cautious. I've dealt with other buildings in the past where people have put solar panels on outbuildings or indeed on freestanding sort of posts set into the ground in their garden. And these are all things that you could perhaps look into if you can't put it on your house. But the best advice I can give you is talk to your council first and see what your various options might be.
Excellent. Thanks both. Next, we have a question from Kate, thinking again about solar panels. She's a beautiful grade 2 listed tiled roof. She'd like to be more energy efficient, but covering up the roof feels like sacrilege. Are there any other solutions?
Okay, shall I come in on this one? And Dan, you probably got something to say. So first of all, grade 2 listed. If your roof is visible from a footpath or road, then you're not likely to get planning permission anyway, I think. But I'll leave that one for Dan to talk about. So, but there are other options. I'd say the first one is if you can't put solar on your house for any reason, and there's plenty of other reasons why people can't put solar on their house, then consider paying for solar panels somewhere else. And there are community energy organisations that are not for profit that will put solar installations on other buildings, and you can buy community shares in those organisations and in those installations, and that's a way and get a return from those shares, and that is a way of creating renewable energy somewhere else. I'm going to give a little plug for Energise South Downs. They're our local community energy organisation, so do have a look at their website and you can see how to do that. And other options are, I mean, Dan just mentioned outbuildings. Outbuildings and garages might be within the curtilage of the listed building, but still that might be possible, would be a planning decision. Or ground mounted, if you've got a bit of land next to the building, that could be an option to put some on the ground. Dan, anything to add to that?
I wouldn't say that grade 2 listing automatically means you can't get permission to put solar panels on the roofs. We've got a number of listed buildings across the district which have got solar panels on the roofs, and I've seen that not just in Winchester but also in the Basingstoke and Deane borough. So by all means do speak to your council, because provided it's not on the front of the building, then I think you may well find that you're pushing an open door.
Excellent, thanks. I'm going to throw in one more question on solar panels from Amanda. Amanda, I'll come back to the rest of your question later when we're talking about heating. Amanda asks, she's looking at solar panels, but has to do east facing because she's in the conservation area. Is that okay?
Okay, so sorry, B. So Amanda, yes, absolutely. In terms of feasibility, as in will they work, will they be productive, then yes, a solar panel on an east or west facing roof loses about 15% of the generation compared to it being on a south facing roof. Certainly panels don't need to be on direct south facing roofs. In fact, some people are now fitting solar panels on north facing roofs while they're also putting them on south, east and west, because the ambient light that get on a north facing roof creates about 50% of the generation. It can still be viable. Modern solar panels are much more efficient than they used to be, and you now get, very roughly, if this means anything, 450 watts per panel. 10 years ago it would have been more like 200, which has changed the financial dynamics. Yes, east facing. The other thing to consider with east facing is that you will get most of your generation in the morning and through to midday, and then it will stop generating in the afternoon. Mostly, you'll lose most of your generation in the afternoon and the evening. So thinking about maybe storage, battery storage, or when you're going to be using your power in the morning, what you're going to be doing with it. Dan, anything to add to that?
Nope, nothing to add.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Stu. I'm going to throw in one more question about solar panels and then we'll move on. Bethany asks, how long do solar panels last and can they be recycled?
Okay, let's deal with the second bit first. Definitely they can be recycled. The main materials used to make solar panels are silica and aluminium, both very recyclable. I think about 98% of a solar panel is made up from those two materials. Very recyclable. What there needs to be more of is schemes to enable that to happen. And we as a charity are confident that as solar panels start to age, because we're obviously quite early on in the process of installing solar panels, more of these schemes will be set up. There'll be more of a demand. As with all recycling, there needs to be people who can do it, and there needs to be markets which can make it work financially. And we're confident that will. It's already starting to happen, and hopefully will happen more. In terms of how long they last, usually you have a guaranteed life of 25 years on a solar panel. Most solar panels come with a product guarantee of 25 years. Performance will drop off a little bit in that time, and there's usually within the guarantee you might get somewhere between 80 and 90% generation compared to new by that time, but guaranteed for 25 years, and they should go on for quite a bit longer than that. Okay.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on to thermal efficiency and all things insulation and repairs. Sarah asks, the mortar between the external bricks are disintegrating. Is there anything I can do to help remedy this that is not extortionate? And would you advise against wall insulation until the walls are remedied?
Okay. So the first thing to say, I suppose, is how old is the building, and what type of material is the mortar made of? Because if it's a historic building, it's likely to be lime-based mortar. Dan was talking earlier about moisture permeability, moisture moving through buildings. What you would sometimes people use cement-based mortar to patch up old lime mortar. That can cause problems. Hopefully that hasn't happened with your building. It does sound like it needs repointing. And the only cheap way of doing that is doing it yourself, I suppose, which is not the most pleasant job. Most people probably wouldn't take that on as a DIY job, but it can be. Otherwise, yeah, I
Sarah's
think it
just,
sounds like the mortar needs. Sorry, Bia.
sorry,
Yeah.
it's historic lime mortar, apparently,
Okay,
in
yeah,
response
in which
to.
case it would need lime mortar to replace it, to maintain that moisture permeability. And in terms of wall insulation, um, it all depends what type of insulation you're doing. If it's a historic building with a lovely brick face to it, which it sounds like it is, it's very unlikely that you would either want external wall insulation or that it would be permitted. And you get planning permission to do that. If it's very old and it's solid, which sounds likely as well, there's no cavity in the wall, then the cavity wall insulation is not an option. I have seen a building that was built in 1880 with very early wall cavities that were filled with insulation, and it's been in there for 10 years and there's no problem. But that's unusual. Your other option then, your final option then is internal wall insulation using natural materials to maintain the moisture permeability. If your building's listed, then that was something, you need to get listed consent for that almost certainly. There are other options short of actual solid insulation on the inside, which could be a thermal insulating plaster that has cork and air in it to increase the thermal efficiency. But yeah, I think really you need some specialist advice with an older building in terms of insulation about the best way forward. Looking at the rest of your question, fireplaces, open fireplaces, chimney balloons certainly are an option. Just don't forget to take it out if you like the chimney, like the fire. And the other option, because what chimney balloons do is basically you stick a balloon, as you'll know from the question, but some people might not. You stick a balloon up the chimney, you inflate it, and it blocks most of the draft in the chimney. A little bit of gap left around the edges, so you get a little bit of ventilation in that chimney void, just to stop any damp problems building up. Another option is something called a chimney sheep, which is not a sheep, but is a rectangular piece of woolen felt that is made to fit the chimney size and goes up and performs the same function. Okay.
Thanks, Stu. Um, the next question is from Laurie, who asks, we live on the ground floor of a grade 2 listed building, which has been converted into flats. Is wooden sash windows, which swell when the wood gets wet, which causes the frame to stick. The windowsills are 60 centimetre deep. It's quite difficult currently to open the window. they're single glazed. It's a listed building, so they've been advised that they may not double glaze those windows and can't replace the wood with a different material. How are we meant to manage this question?
Okay. I think Dan might have something to say, but I think my first thought when I saw your question, it's a tricky one to answer without really, seeing the windows, but I would have thought there is a way of renovating and repainting those windows to seal them from the damp, to stop that swelling up happening in winter. So my first thought would be to look at getting them renovated in the summer, letting the wood dry out thoroughly, and then sealing them in some way to stop that water penetration happening, which is causing the wood to swell. That would be my first thoughts. Dan, what would you say about that?
I think you should speak to a joiner. So lots of joiners are really good at maintaining sash windows in particular because there's so many of them. What you might find they do, and I did this in my house, is that they can gently remove excess layers of paint. They can repaint the windows. They can also add strips so that when the window is shut, it's thoroughly draft proofed, but it's also much easier to open and close because you're not having quite the same thick layers of paint that are sort of holding it together. Because you've got a particularly deep window sill, if you're interested in making the building more energy efficient, a really good option to you could be secondary glazing because you've got lots of space to put it in. There's all sorts of different companies available who can do that sort of work for you, and some of them will do work that actually sort of renovates the window and does all the sort of repair work that you need done, but also add secondary glazing at the same time. By all means, do have a look online. There's loads of different options. But if you are interested in the option of replacing your windows, because that's not necessarily impossible, come and talk to your council if you haven't already done so, because they may actually be able to come and look at your windows and give you an idea of how old they are and whether they'd give you permission to replace them. Because often there can be a bit of a myth about what you can and can't do in listed buildings, and it's always best to actually get it from the horse's mouth, as it were, and get somebody from the council to actually tell you.
And I'll just add to that, on the secondary glazing side, a plug for a couple of case studies on our website, on WinACC's website. One for the building that Dan mentioned in his presentation, one of the buildings, the Grade 2 listed building in Winchester. It's actually in St Swithin Street, and we've got a case study of all that's been done to that on our website, which is really interesting to read. And then the other one, in terms of secondary glazing, we did a case study of Porter's Lodge, which is a very iconic 16th century building in the inner close of Winchester Cathedral, which had a retrofit that included very sympathetic secondary glazing, because I think people often think secondary glazing is going to look ugly. It's very possible to have it made so that there are firms that specialize in historic buildings and secondary glazing where the framing is matched up and all sorts of other things to make it look, quite nice indeed. Okay.
Thanks both. Follow on, well, a question from a different person, but also about windows. Jacqueline asks, when I wanted to find out whether I needed planning permissions to replace 1908 sash windows, I was told I had to put in an application. I was told by the window company I did not need permission. Can you clarify which is accurate?
That's definitely one for Dan. Yeah.
Okie doke. So this is difficult to answer without knowing your address. So in a listed building, yes, you'd absolutely need listed building consent to replace windows. Your question, you refer to planning permission. Assuming your house isn't listed and you're not in a conservation area that has an Article 4 direction, the national rules say that you can replace windows without needing planning permission, provided that those windows use materials of a similar visual appearance, which is why in lots of places, and I'm not encouraging this, you get lots of people who've replaced wooden sash windows with plastic windows that might vaguely look like wood from a distance if you squint. But in many cases, that is the situation. However, because your council have told you to submit an application, they are the people who actually have the influence over what goes on here. So I would suggest you speak to your council again to clarify why you need an application, and they should be able to answer that question without too much difficulty.
Brilliant, thank you both. I have a question here from Helena, which says the loft in my 1911 semi-detached home in Winchester was insulated about 15 years ago by a contractor as part of a subsidised energy conserving scheme. A few years ago, developed damp problems in a bedroom ceiling and have concluded the loft insulation was poorly laid, which has contributed to the damp. Loft access is challenging by a traditional glass panel. Is there a scheme whereby the loft can be re-insulated, and can Helena claim insulation from the firm who laid the original pink insulation material?
Okay, tricky one, this to answer without knowing the full details, but I'll try. So I think the first thing I'd say is that loft insulation doesn't usually go wrong. It's a non-invasive type of insulation. It's If there has been a problem with loft insulation, it would usually be to do with reducing ventilation of the loft space. It's unusual for the insulation itself to cause a problem by being laid on the floor. But if, for example, if it's jammed into the eaves of a roof, that can block ventilation because it's important that a loft space, because it's a cold space, you don't want to get a moisture build-up in there that could lead to the timbers getting wet and then rotting. In terms of, what do you do about the problem you've got? Uh, First of all, check whether you have any kind of warranty. There are various schemes to provide insurance-backed warranties on insulation. That they may have a look at the warranty that, if anything, that you've got from the contractor, because most warranties for insulation, all insulation warranties are often 20 or 25 years long. Go back to the grant provider. You say it was a subsidised scheme. There will be, was that a local authority? Was that, who was managing that scheme and providing that scheme? And go back to them and see what they will do about it. Is there a scheme to where the loft can be re-insulated? I mean, that's almost like obviously you would be looking for that to be done as part of the compensation if you get it sorted out. As a separate answer, if you're looking for grant subsidised loft insulation schemes right now, the people you need to talk to are the people that B works for, really, the Environment Centre. They've got lots of very good advisors who are trained to understand all the eligibility criteria around energy efficiency grant schemes. But the short answer is they are means tested. And so you have to be on a lower income. I won't go into details of that, exactly what income, but I'm sure B can signpost us now to her grant advisors. I think that just covers what I can say. Sorry, Dan. Yeah.
No, the one thing I would add is just to make sure that the moisture problem, the damp problem that you've noticed, make sure that is caused by the insulation and not just caused by something more simple to fix, like a slipped slate or something.
Brilliant, thanks both. I was wondering if Joe, you wanted to come in here. Joe also works at the Environment Centre. Either to answer this question, or there is an additional question around some of the bad press on the eco and GBIS schemes, and whether there's anything we can learn from that when looking at future schemes like the Warm Homes Plan. So any sort of comments on?
Yeah, thanks. Very, very good questions. I'd echo what Stu was saying about the specifics of the loft insulation case, and we'd be really happy to have a chat with you. We'll show you contact details later, but speak to me or one of my colleagues at the Environment Centre, and we can see what course of action you can take about that loft insulation. Regarding the bad press about eco and the Great British Insulation Scheme, I think the big thing that the government have decided to do is to end those schemes, and they're kind of rejigging how all of their funding happens through the Warm Homes Plan. And I think the rearrangement of how it's all financed will hopefully address some of the problems with the poor standards that have happened. And they're also looking at the role of Trustmark and the remit that they'll be given going forward. So yeah, no, bit of a vague answer at this stage, but hopefully there will be learning taking place. Thanks, Joe.
Conscious of time, so I'm gonna move us on to heating now, heat pumps, and then we will move towards closing. That means there will be some questions unanswered, but we will finish the session. I will finish the session by telling you how you can speak to Stu and Joe and other retrofit advisors they work with to your heart's content. So hopefully, yeah, they'll provide an opportunity to answer those at a later date. So somebody asks, well, they're interested to hear thoughts on the suitability of older buildings for heat pumps. My understanding is that they do not work very well in poorly insulated or drafty homes, which older buildings tend to be. Any thoughts on that?
Okay, I'll try not to talk for too long about this. But I think the first thing to say is there is a myth that heat pumps will only work in very well insulated buildings. The building that I've mentioned, that Dan mentioned, the 17th century listed building in Winchester, is heated by a heat pump. The National Trust has a scheme to convert the heating systems in a lot of their stately buildings, 17th century stately homes to ground source heat pumps. It's certainly possible to heat older homes with heat pumps. It's sensible to do what you can to improve the thermal efficiency of a building. When you put a heat pump in, it's sensible to do that anyway, to reduce the drafts, to look at what you can do. It's challenging improving the thermal efficiency of older buildings, but there are always things you can do, and we've touched on them today. The obvious ones: loft insulation, draft proofing, secondary glazing. Relatively cheap, non-invasive, make quite a difference. Do what you can, but heat pumps will work in pretty much most buildings if they're sized correctly and they're used correctly. And when you hear about heat pumps not keeping a building warm, it's usually one of those two things that's gone wrong. So the system design might not have been correct, and the way in which it's operated may not be correct. So, there are different ways of operating heat pumps, which I won't go into detail now. But Dan, anything to add to that?
No, nothing to add. Very sensible.
Okay.
Excellent, thanks. And a follow-on question about heat pumps from Kate. Can you achieve heat pumps with floors that have brick/quarries that are laid straight onto the ground? Some of them are very cracked. It feels difficult to achieve anything with these floors without spoiling their history.
Okay. Sorry, Dan, go.
Yeah, so eminently possible. The good thing about solid floors is that they tend to have fairly constant temperature throughout the year of at least 10 degrees, if not higher. So actually, a heat pump should work still reasonably well in that situation. Clearly, you could improve it if you insulated the floor, but it should still work quite lovely.
Brilliant, thank you. We have a couple of questions, I think 2 or 3, around insulating wallpaper. Basically just asking, what is your take?
Okay, I'll be interested in what Dan says. My take is it doesn't do very much, but it does something. If you think about the thermal resistance of a material, if you think about insulation, then it has to have very high insulating properties if it's going to be very thin in order to be effective. Now, if most insulation that you would put on as internal insulation would be up to 10 centimeters thick to have any real effect. I don't think that wallpaper is going to be magically have a huge thermal resistance. It's going to be relatively quite thin. So it will do something. If that's your only option for whatever reason, it's worth doing, but don't have too high expectations of what it can do, is what I said. Dan, what do you think?
I view it with quite a lot of skepticism because it does sound like it's almost too good to be true. And indeed, if it does work, it might only work by trapping warm, moist air rather than being breathable. So I would approach with extreme caution.
Thanks both. I'm going to end with a broader question from Amanda. It's a mid-19th century property. Is there a way of maximising or economising heating? Hopefully an opportunity to touch on anything that hasn't already been touched on in the Q&A. Any thoughts?
Okay, well, I suppose the first thing to say is if you are using a boiler, a fossil fuel boiler, which you may well be, if it's a combi boiler without a water tank, then make sure it's operating as efficiently as possible. And the way to do that is to make sure the condensing operation is operating efficiently by the flow temperature not being too high. And if you Google something called, which sounds like a dodgy website, but it's not, moneysavingboilerchallenge.com, I think is the website. That will give you full details on that. The caution about that is it has to be a combi boiler, because if you've got a water tank, you don't want to create a risk of Legionnaire's disease by having the water tank too cool. That's one thing you can do. Most people do have combi condensing boilers now. But what else? So when you say maximising and economising, I suppose that means saving money, getting more heat for less money, which heat pumps are very good at. Once you've got, the initial installation cost. I think people, somebody around the corner from me had a heat pump fitted the other day, £3,900 for a 3-bedroom semi after the boiler upgrade scheme grant. Really not much more expensive than a fossil fuel boiler. So yeah, it's definitely an option to think about. Dan, anything to add?
Some very practical thoughts. I mean, think about how you use the house. Are you heating spaces that you don't actually use very often? Hopefully, if you're in a mid-terraced house, a bit like mine, then you may find that actually you get a lot of heat from your neighbours. But just think about the places you're heating to make sure you're not heating more space than you need to, because it's space heating, not people heating.
Thank you so much, both. That does bring us to the end of our Q&A. Just a note to say, Jim, I'm responding to your question in the chat box. Amelia and Roz and Amanda, sorry for not being able to get to your further questions. I'm going to start screen sharing again now. Just to share the details of the case studies, which Stu mentioned earlier. These are both hosted on the WinACC website, and you can find a URL or a QR code to access them. And finally, to touch on the My Home Made Better service, which is a way that you can speak to Stu or Joe or any of our colleagues further. So My Home Made Better is a Hampshire-wide energy advice service. We are very grateful for the support of Hampshire County Council, Southampton City Council, Portsmouth City Council, Winchester City Council, and numerous other organisations and authorities. We can provide free and impartial advice tailored to your home, and we will talk through all the options available to you, thinking about a whole house retrofit approach, and the ideal order of having works done, helping you know where to start. This just maps out how it works in practice. Once you've spoken to one of our advisors in person or by phone or at your home, we'll also send you a summary of next steps, which includes grants and support that you may be eligible for, as well as our supplier directory, which contains information about local accredited installers. And we're here to answer further questions every step of the way. You're always welcome to get back in touch. So these are our details. You can give us a call, drop us an email, or visit our website to contact us online. That does bring us up to 7:30, so I wanted to end by saying a very big thank you to Daniel, Stu and Joe for your time this evening. And I am just going to pop a survey up. Hopefully you can see that now. If anyone has a moment to give us some feedback, that would be much appreciated as well. Thank you, everyone. I hope that if you've got pancakes on the cards for the rest of this evening, I hope that you enjoy them. And yeah, we will be delighted to hear from you if you do get in touch for further advice.